The boy who wasn't supposed to read. Picture this, a young boy, no more than 12 years old, hiding in a Baltimore alley with a stolen book clutched to his chest. His heart pounds, not from running, but from fear. If caught, he'll face the whip. But Frederick Bailey, not yet Douglass, has discovered something more powerful than any chain that binds him. He's discovered words. In 1826 America, teaching an enslaved person to read was illegal in most southern states. Slaveholders understood a truth that would eventually dismantle their entire system. Literacy is liberation. Knowledge is power. And a man who can read can think for himself. Young Frederick had convinced white children in his neighborhood to teach him letters in exchange for bread. He practiced writing in the dirt with sticks. He traced letters from discarded newspapers. Every word he learned was an act of rebellion. Every sentence he read was a step toward freedom. But here's what makes Frederick Douglass's story extraordinary. He didn't just escape slavery. He didn't just survive. He transformed his pain into purpose, his story into a movement, and his voice into the conscience of a nation. And the lessons from his journey? They're as relevant today as they were 175 years ago. The escape that changed everything. February 1838. Frederick, now 20 years old, boards a train heading north. He's disguised as a sailor, carrying forged papers that identify him as a free man. His heart races with every mile. One wrong look, one suspicious conductor, and he'll be dragged back to Maryland in chains. But Frederick makes it. He reaches New York City, a free man. Most escaped slaves would have disappeared into anonymity, grateful simply to be free. Not Frederick. Within 3 years of his escape, he's standing before crowds of hundreds, then thousands, telling his story. His voice, deep, resonant, commanding, holds audiences spellbound. Here's the first lesson we can learn. Your story is your superpower. Frederick understood something profound. His lived experience as an enslaved person gave him a moral authority that no white abolitionist could match. When he spoke about the brutality of slavery, he wasn't theorizing. He was testifying. He bore the scars on his back to prove it. In 1845, he published his autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. It became an instant bestseller, selling 5,000 copies in the first 4 months. By 1850, it had sold 30,000 copies, extraordinary for that era. Think about that. A man who had been legally considered property just 7 years earlier was now one of America's best-selling authors. The power of owning your narrative. But publishing his story came with enormous risk. By revealing his real name and the details of his escape, Frederick made himself a target. Under the Fugitive Slave Act, he could be captured and returned to slavery at any moment. His former owner now knew exactly where to find him. Friends urged him to flee to England for safety, and he did, for 2 years. But even in exile, he didn't hide. He lectured throughout Britain and Ireland, building international support for abolition. British supporters eventually purchased his legal freedom for £150, allowing him to return to America as a legally free man. Here's the second lesson. Sometimes you have to risk everything to become everything you're meant to be. Frederick could have stayed silent. He could have lived quietly in the North, grateful for his freedom. Instead, he chose to speak, knowing it might cost him everything. He chose to be visible when invisibility was safer. He chose to fight when surrender was easier. How many of us silence our own voices because we're afraid of criticism? How many of us hide our stories because we fear judgment? How many of us play small because standing tall feels too risky? Frederick Douglass teaches us that your voice matters more than your comfort. Building a movement, one speech at a time. Back in America, Frederick didn't just speak, he built. In 1847, he founded the North Star, an abolitionist newspaper. Its motto, "Right is of no sex, truth is of no color, God is the Father of us all, and we are all brethren." For 16 years, Frederick published this paper, often at great personal financial cost. He mortgaged his home to keep it running. Why? Because he understood that sustained change requires sustained effort. One speech might inspire, but a weekly newspaper? That builds a movement. Frederick spoke at over 1,000 events during his lifetime. He traveled tens of thousands of miles by train, carriage, and ship. He debated pro-slavery advocates. He advised President Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. He recruited black soldiers for the Union Army, including his own sons. The third lesson? Consistency beats intensity. Frederick didn't change America with one dramatic gesture. He changed it through decades of relentless, consistent advocacy. Week after week, speech after speech, article after article. He showed up even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. In our instant gratification culture, we often want immediate results. We want to go viral, make an impact overnight, change the world with one post. But real change, lasting change, comes from showing up consistently over time. The speech that shook America. July 5th, 1852, Rochester, New York. Frederick stands before a crowd to deliver what would become one of the most powerful speeches in American history. What to the slave is your 4th of July? His words cut like a knife. What then to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him, more than all other days in the year, the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your denunciations of tyrants brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality hollow mockery. Imagine the courage it took to say those words, to stand before a predominantly white audience and call out their hypocrisy, to speak truth to power when power could destroy you. But Frederick didn't speak from bitterness, he spoke from hope. He believed America could live up to its ideals. He believed the Constitution, properly interpreted, was an anti-slavery document. He believed in the possibility of change. The fourth lesson? Truth-telling is an act of love. Frederick criticized America because he believed in America. He called out its failures because he believed it could do better. His harshest words came from his deepest hope. Today, we often confuse criticism with hatred. We assume that pointing out problems means you don't care about solutions. But Frederick shows us that the opposite is true. Those who love something most are often its fiercest critics because they see its potential. The self-made man. In the 1850s and 1860s, Frederick delivered a lecture he called Self-Made Men. In it, he argued that success comes not from luck or privilege, but from hard work, perseverance, and self-determination. This might sound like typical American bootstrap philosophy, but coming from Frederick, it carried different weight. Here was a man who had literally made himself, who had transformed himself from property into a person, from slave into statesman. But Frederick's version of self-made wasn't about rugged individualism. He acknowledged the help he'd received along the way. the white children who taught him to read, the abolitionists who supported his work, the British friends who purchased his freedom. The fifth lesson: you can be self-made and still need community. Frederick understood that personal responsibility and mutual aid aren't opposites, they're partners. He worked incredibly hard, but he also accepted help. He pulled himself up, but he also reached back to pull others up behind him. In our hyper-individualistic culture, we often think asking for help is weakness. We think we should succeed entirely on our own. But Frederick shows us that true strength includes knowing when to accept support. The long fight for justice. The Civil War ended slavery in 1865, but Frederick's work didn't end there. He spent the next 30 years fighting for black civil rights, women's suffrage, and economic justice. He served as U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia, Recorder of Deeds, and Minister to Haiti. He never stopped speaking, never stopped writing, never stopped fighting. Even in his 70s, Frederick was delivering speeches. On February 20th, 1895, he attended a women's rights meeting. That evening, at home, he collapsed and died. His last day on earth was spent fighting for justice. The fifth lesson: the work is never finished. Frederick could have retired after the Civil War. He'd achieved his primary goal. Slavery was abolished. He was famous, respected, financially secure. He could have rested. But he understood that freedom isn't a destination. It's a direction. There's always more work to do. Always more justice to pursue. Always more voices to amplify. What can Frederick Douglass teach us today? So what can we learn from Frederick Douglass in 2025? Everything. 1. Your voice is your power. Whatever your background, whatever your circumstances, you have a story that matters. Don't wait for permission to tell it. Don't wait until you feel ready. Your voice, right now, as it is, has the power to change minds and move hearts. 2. Your past doesn't define your future. Frederick was born into slavery. By every measure of his society, he was supposed to be nothing. But he refused to accept that narrative. He wrote his own story. You can too. 3. Consistency creates change. You don't need to change the world overnight. You just need to show up, day after day, and do the work. Small actions, repeated consistently, create massive results. 4. Truth-telling is courage. In a world of carefully curated social media personas and corporate speak, honest voices stand out. Be willing to speak uncomfortable truths. Be willing to challenge the status quo. Be willing to risk disapproval for the sake of integrity. 5. Education is liberation. Frederick risks his life to learn to read. What are you doing with your access to unlimited information? Are you learning, growing, expanding your mind, or are you scrolling mindlessly? Honor Frederick's legacy by taking your education seriously. 6. Your story can become a movement. Frederick didn't just escape slavery. He turned his experience into a catalyst for national change. Your story, your struggle, your journey, it's not just about you. It could be the inspiration someone else needs. It could be the spark that ignites a movement. Your voice can rewrite your future and change history. Here's the truth that Frederick Douglass embodied. You are not a victim of your circumstances. You are a voice that can change them. You might not have been born into slavery, but you face your own chains, fear, doubt, limiting beliefs, systemic barriers. The question is, will you accept those chains or will you break them? Frederick shows us that one voice, speaking truth consistently and courageously, can change a nation. Imagine what millions of voices could do. Your voice matters. The story you're living right now, with all its struggles and setbacks, could be the story that inspires someone else to keep going. The truth you're afraid to speak could be the truth someone else desperately needs to hear. The change you want to see could start with the words you choose to say. Frederick Douglass was born Frederick Bailey, a slave with no last name, no rights, no future. He died Frederick Douglass, one of the most influential Americans who ever lived. He didn't wait for someone to give him permission to matter. He didn't wait for circumstances to be perfect. He didn't wait for the right moment. He spoke, he wrote, he fought, he showed up, and he changed everything. What will you do with your voice? So here's my challenge to you. What truth have you been afraid to speak? What story have you been afraid to tell? What change have you been afraid to pursue? Frederick Douglass teaches us that your voice, yes, your voice, has the power to rewrite your future and change history, but only if you use it. Don't wait for permission. Don't wait for the perfect moment. Don't wait until you feel ready. Start now. Write that article. Record that video. Have that difficult conversation. Stand up for that cause. Tell your story. Because somewhere out there, someone needs to hear exactly what you have to say. Someone is waiting for your voice to give them courage. Someone's life will change because you chose to speak. Frederick Douglass was a self-made man, not because he did it alone, but because he refused to let anyone else define who he could become. Now it's your turn.
Your voice can rewrite your future. Your story can change history. The only question is, will you speak? Frederick Douglass once said, "If there is no struggle, there is no progress." The struggle to find your voice, to tell your truth, to stand for what's right, that struggle is where your power lives. Don't run from it. Embrace it. Because on the other side of that struggle is the person you were always meant to become.